Strangers, you can find more Strange and Unexplained on Patreon at patreon.com/grabbagcollab. Grabbag has everything from true crime to advice to recap shows, health and wellness, and more. We've got book clubs, happy hours, bonus content, early access to merch and live shows, and more. For just $5 a month, you get all the regular shows, and for an extra $3, you get all that, plus Crimes of the Centuries and Strange and Unexplained early and ad-free. So join us over at patreon.com/grabbagcollab for more amazing content. And now, on to the show. When an icon dies, how can we truly let them go? When someone has made an indelible mark on the world, do they ever really leave? Is it any wonder that some people refuse to let go of a beloved figure, even in death? Welcome to Strange and Unexplained with me, Daisy Egan. I am someone who went through an Elvis phase for a while. Nothing diehard, really only a best-of compilation on repeat. But the man, the myth, the legend that is Elvis Presley left the building 2 years before I entered it. So my investment in his life and death is minimal. When I would hear rumors he'd been spotted in a McDonald's bathroom or the plumbing aisle at Home Depot with the accompanying he faked his death theories, they barely registered. If a famous guy wanted to disappear, who was I to stand in his way? I don't care one way or the other, though it's hard for me to believe that one of the most famous people who ever lived pulled off one of the greatest hoaxes of all time and remained at large even in death. Especially not while living in Kalamazoo and Simi Valley, of all places. Regardless of our personal opinions of Elvis, his influence on music and popular culture is undeniable. He was a very big deal, and then he died on the toilet. The official version of the morning of August 16, 1977 is that Elvis spent a restless evening before being trucked to a midnight dental appointment where he was treated for tooth pain, nabbed a new pain prescription, and returned to the house and was unable to sleep. He got up at various intervals to play racquetball, have his hair washed, play the piano, and read the morning paper, all while taking various drugs throughout. Then, around 8:30 in the morning, without any sleep, he got out of bed and told his girlfriend Ginger, more than 20 years his junior, that he was going to the bathroom. Ginger found him 5 hours later, face down on the bathroom floor, rigor mortis having already set in, a copy of the book A Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus beside him. 5 hours later? 5 hours? Could you imagine your partner being like, I'm gonna go take a leak, and they don't come back for 5 hours? Even if he was dropping a serious deuce, if my husband was in the bathroom for more than 20 minutes, I'd start getting a little worried. 1 hour later, I'd be banging on the door with a high-fiber smoothie and a couple of X-Lax. Anyway. Aides came running, called an ambulance, and rushed him to Memphis Baptist Memorial Hospital. Besides being one of the most recognizable faces in the world at that point, Elvis was a familiar figure at Memphis Baptist, having just been through a couple of rounds of detox there in days previous. It's been reported that various persons tried to administer CPR, which seems a bit much if rigor was indeed present. It's also said that he was cleaned up, as was his bedroom, before anyone from outside was called to shuttle his lifeless body to the hospital. This isn't that far-fetched, honestly. Famous people have handlers for a reason, and those handlers are expected to handle things post-mortem as well. At any rate, a little past 3:30 that afternoon on August 16, 1977, the world heard the crushing news. The king was dead. He was only 42 years old. According to People magazine, quote, "The world was in shock upon learning the news of Elvis's death. Approximately 25,000 people, family, friends, and fans of the singer, swarmed to Graceland in 1977 to catch one last glimpse of the musician they deemed king ahead of his burial." End quote. Elvis's wife Priscilla recalled, quote, I was still shocked. It was just too hard to believe. And going out the gates in the limo and seeing the streets lined up on both sides all the way to the cemetery, you'd see glimpses, you'd see people crying, hysterical, fainting. And that's how impactful it was, and still to this day. People come around the same time, and they're all there. End quote. One woman reportedly climbed the fence at Forest Hill Cemetery after hours to pay her respects at his grave. Elvis's home, Graceland, became a tourist destination. Fans flocked to the king's home to pay their respects, but some claim they got more than they bargained for. Six months after Elvis died, a bereft visitor to Graceland was taking pictures and happened to snap a shot of the pool house from about 30 yards away in the meditation garden. When they returned home, they had the pictures developed, and lo, right there, behind the glass door to the pool house, plain as day, kinda, you could see Elvis, seated, looking out, watching the crowds. This was not the first sighting of Elvis post-mortem. Some of Elvis's diehard fans just couldn't accept that their beloved icon was really gone. He was so young. He was so rich. He was so famous. Of course, you and I both know full well that being young, rich, and famous doesn't make you immortal. Just ask Judy Garland, James Dean, Tupac, or Biggie. But we also know that when they're caught in a trap of the mind, they can't go back to reality because they love him too much, baby. You didn't really think I wouldn't do that, did you? Do you know who I am? Have you any idea who I am? Okay, so someone was insisting they had photographic proof that the king lived and was, for some reason, just casually hanging out in his pool house while the public wandered around taking photos. That was enough for a whole bevy of folks to emphatically say, "Told you he wasn't dead." In 1997, the last time Gallup asked America if they believed Elvis was still alive, 4% said they thought he was indeed among the living. 3% more said they were unsure if he was dead or alive. Giving the benefit of the doubt here, that's 7% of Americans who've seen the evidence and deemed it convincing or worthy of consideration. The evidence that Elvis didn't die that morning? There's a lot. Especially if you use a very loose definition of the word evidence. Those who claim the king didn't die in 77 point first to his coffin. Why on earth would a coffin weigh 900 pounds? You heard that right. Elvis's coffin, which was named, by the way, the Promethean, weighed nearly half a ton. Now, listen. I don't know why the weight of the coffin would lead to suspicious minds. One would think if there was an elaborate hoax, they would have made the coffin weigh something far more normal. I would even buy 400 pounds. Why would they be like, tee-hee-hee, let's fake his death and also make his coffin weigh the same as a polar bear? That'll throw him off. But the coffin was made of bronze, and you know me, stranger, I'm no metalsmith, but I'd wager a solid bronze coffin carrying a man weighing about 260 pounds might weigh 900 pounds. Incidentally, the coffin cost $25,000, nearly $130,000 in today money, enough to pay off both my student loan and my husband's with a little left over for the mortgage. Everything is fine. But it wasn't just the coffin that made people question. It was the figure inside the coffin at the open casket ceremony. The king's face in life was showing the wear and tear of years of serious drug and alcohol use, but somehow his visage in the casket seemed slimmer and younger than it should have. The only picture of Elvis taken post-death is the one the National Enquirer paid Elvis's cousin Billy Smith $18,000 to take of Elvis at rest in the casket. That's the one that shows a noticeably thin, young Elvis with the wrong nose and what looks like glued-on sideburns. The negatives were destroyed in a fire at the Enquirer offices, so we'll never know if someone tampered with them. It's certainly possible Elvis had a clause in his will or final directive or whatever that stipulated not only who would craft his posthumous image for viewing, but how he wanted to look. All he needed was some born-again embalmer who thought rock and roll was the devil's music to make sure Elvis looked his worst at his viewing. Indeed, the Memphis funeral home who handled the funeral and burial was a popular haunt for Elvis while he was still alive. He liked to visit the funeral home, listen, to each their own, and would sing at some services. Even if he didn't have concrete instructions for his handling and care in death, the staff at the funeral home probably liked him enough that the embalmer wanted to make sure Elvis was restored to his pre-bloated, pre-white jumpsuit days. But those inclined toward conspiracy will tell you that the figure in the coffin was just that, a figure made of wax, or at least the head was. They'd been gifted the wax head, they say, by Madame Tussauds in London. Indeed, some claim the air around Elvis's coffin was cooler than normal. That's because they say there was an air conditioner in the coffin to keep the wax from melting, which would also explain the excessive weight of the thing. Again, not a metalsmith, but isn't metal a conductor? Like, if the bronze coffin was being held in a cold location to prevent decomposing, not melting wax, wouldn't it retain some of that coolness for a while? I mean, I'm a dummy, so I definitely could be wrong. Maybe it was an air conditioner. At any rate, the heavy coffin, the uncanny valley-like face, and the pool house photo were proof positive that the king still lived. Long live the king. But just in case you're not convinced, there's more. "12 days after Elvis died, 3 men were found near the Presley family mausoleum with explosives on hand. Seems they were planning on stealing the corpse to, some believe, prove to the mafia that Elvis was D-E-A-D dead. Maybe. Or maybe they thought they could hold his dead body for ransom. Indeed, according to a piece on thethings.com, quote, the 3 claimed they were offered $40,000 each by a mystery person who intended to demand $10 million from the family for the return of the singer's body, end quote. But the believers stick by the notion that the mafia sent the grave robbers as a kind of proof of death thing. And to them, that just added to the suspicion. If the mafia doesn't think he's really dead, maybe he isn't really dead. But why would the mafia care whether or not Elvis was dead? Because Elvis was the most important undercover agent ever. That's right. Elvis was the one who fingered a whole band of mobsters operating a massive crime ring and drug distribution scheme aimed at shaking the very foundations of American teenagehood and undermining the democracy we live in. Also, it has something to do with confounding the communists who were taking over the land, led as they were by Jane Fonda, the Beatles, and the Black Panthers. How do we know this? Elvis himself volunteered for the job due to his love of country. In 1970, he sent a handwritten letter to President Nixon, which actually exists and was, as far as anyone knows, actually written by the king himself, that read, in part, quote, "First, I would like to introduce myself. I am Elvis Presley and admire you and have great respect for your office. I talked to Vice President Agnew in Palm Springs 3 weeks ago and expressed my concerns for our country. The drug culture, the hippie elements, the SDS, Black Panthers, etc. do not consider me their enemy, or as they call it, the establishment. I call it America, and I love it. Sir, I can and will be of any service that I can to help this country out. I have no concern or motives other than helping this country out. So I wish not to be given a title or appointed position. I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large and will help you out by doing it my way through my communications with people of all ages. First and foremost, I am an entertainer, but all I need is the federal credentials." End quote. He then gave Nixon information about where he was staying while in D.C., along with his alias he used whenever staying at a hotel, John Burroughs, and added he'd stay there as long as it took to get the credentials. He also let Nixon know he had, quote, done an in-depth study of drug abuse and communist brainwashing techniques, and I am right in the middle of this whole thing, and I can and will do the most good, end quote. Nixon's aides arranged an immediate meeting with Elvis and even spitballed a few ideas of how exactly Presley could help out in the war on drugs. In her memoir, Elvis and Me, The True Story of the Love Between Priscilla Presley and the King of Rock and Roll, Priscilla wrote, quote, the narc badge represented some kind of ultimate power to him. With the federal narcotics badge, he believed he could legally enter any country both wearing guns and carrying any drugs he wished, end quote. Most people believe all Elvis had really wanted was to add to his badge collection and maybe to his fantasies that he was more than a seminal cultural icon, that he did something that mattered. I mean, he'd already served in the military, which some certainly consider meaningful. And not for nothing, but the world would be a pretty bleak place without entertainment, and no one can argue that he did an awful lot of entertaining. Anyway, the story goes that the FBI employed Elvis as part of its Operation Fountain Pen from 1976 to 1982. Yes, until 5 years after his death. The operation included a probe of Frederick Pro, a man who purchased one of Elvis's airplanes and bilked the singer and his father Vernon, who handled Elvis's business affairs, out of almost $500,000. I don't know what that's all about, but you have to have one big set of cojones to stiff the king of $500,000. It just so happened that Pro was a pro at conning and ended up on the FBI's radar. So those who like to find connections found a connection, once again, to the king and the FBI. The sting operation that followed in 1977 was said to have brought down a crime ring that had cost its victims billions of dollars. Elvis, when unveiled as the mole, became a marked man. The official story is that Elvis had nothing to do with the sting. His only connection to it was that Frederick Pro, who swindled him and his dad out of money on the airplane deal, happened to be a part of the operation that the FBI took down. But, according to those who know the truth, Elvis had to disappear. He didn't die. He joined the Witness Protection Program. Never mind that there was unlikely to be any place on Earth where he wasn't immediately recognizable, except for, I don't know, the Amazon jungle? Huge price to pay, leaving all that adulation and money behind, but being the kind of true patriot he was doing the hard work of uncovering what was killing America. Talk about sacrifice. According to a Time magazine story in 2017, the FBI files released to date on Presley indicate that he never worked for the agency. Or is that just what they want you to believe? An alternative version of the grave robbing story, which was easily uncovered as the men didn't really come prepared, was that it was likely set up by the family who wanted to impress upon the city of Memphis that Elvis needed to be buried at Graceland, not at Forest Hill, because his body would only be safe within the grounds of his home. Graceland, however, was not zoned for burials. In fact, many years later, one of the men revealed the anonymous benefactor of the body heist was the sheriff working for Elvis's father. The charges on the men were eventually dropped, and Elvis did get moved into the Graceland complex. Those who know the truth will tell you that Elvis Presley is alive and well and living in California. At 89 years old, he lives in Simi Valley in a nice little low-slung ranch-style home with an American flag out front. He goes by his alias John Burroughs. That's according to the team behind the movie Elvis Found Alive, available for your viewing pleasure on YouTube. I didn't watch it. I watched the trailer. That was enough. Honestly, if you're trying to tell me that one of the most recognizable people in the world went into witness protection in Simi Valley with obvious clues as to his real identity right out front for everyone to see, I'm going to assume you have your life savings in NFTs. You know what I mean? But here's what the film tells us really happened from the mouth of Elvis himself, who they somehow got to reveal all, and who sounds remarkably still like a young man of 42, and not how one might expect an octogenarian to sound. A guy named Roscoe, who looked a lot like Elvis, was allegedly already pretty sick and was chosen to be the stand-in for Elvis in his casket. Elvis, you see, had to testify in that important case about how Frederick Proe had hoodwinked him and his dad out of money through a bogus airplane purchase. So Elvis spoke to the grand jury, but knew that his time as Elvis was now up. He put on a show for Ginger to find him on the bathroom floor. Why he would choose the incredibly embarrassing "he died trying to poop" story over, just say, keeling over in literally any other room in his house, we don't know. His mastery of martial arts had taught him how to slow his breathing to the point that non-medical folks would believe he was in fact dead. During the hubbub there at the house, he was switched out with Roscoe, who had been cooling in the pool house. Elvis himself hid in the closet. Ambulance personnel put Roscoe on a stretcher. Someone forgot that they'd locked Elvis into the closet, and he had to bust out, and made his way out to the upstairs bathroom window and onto the rooftop where a DEA helicopter was circling to pick him up. But bad news. The word was already out that Elvis had died, and Graceland was swamped with the grieving. The helicopter couldn't land, so Elvis spent a few months cooling his heels at the pool house where that visitor was able to take a snap of him. Never mind that it would have been impossible for any man, let alone a man of his size, to sit in the doorway in such a way that would have made that picture possible. It doesn't matter! Elvis told the filmmakers all about the wax head from Madame Tussauds, the fake sideburns, the air-conditioned coffin, and finally why his name is misspelled on his gravestone. He said, quote, "I had no intention of putting a hex on myself with my real name there." End quote. Obviously. Small aside, Elvis's middle name on his birth certificate is Aron, Aaron. On the gravestone, it's Aaron. Much confusion still exists over this one. Some say that Elvis thought his parents had misspelled the biblical name on the birth certificate, and he wanted the posthumous biblical correction made for all eternity. They say he made that clear to his father years earlier. Others see it as evidence that he's not actually buried there. And they cite the fact that his coffin was not draped in an American flag, a tribute that he, as a veteran, was entitled to. But Simi Valley Elvis of the film explains that choice. He said he had no intention of disrespecting the American flag by draping it on the coffin of a man who'd never actually served. Asked if he had any regrets about the whole incident, Simi Valley Elvis mentions Roscoe. Quote, "I feel badly to this day. I suspect Dr. Nick may have finished him off to keep him on schedule." End quote. Elvis was put in witness protection in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he worked as a desk clerk. I guess they didn't have TV, movies, music, or newspapers in Kalamazoo. Then, once the heat had cooled off on him a bit, he began work again with the DEA on its important mafia cases. This, of course, would sync with the rash of sightings of the man in and around Kalamazoo in the late 1980s, first at a Burger King and later at a grocery store. Elvis did, in fact, keep some kind of office, Suite 201 in the Columbia Hotel Plaza building in Kalamazoo, where his favorite Gibson guitars were manufactured up to 1984. You can thank the Weekly World News for the word spreading of Kalamazoo's newest resident. Poo-poo it if you like, but there are Kalamazooians. Kalamazooites? Kalamazooers? Fuck it. Folks who live there who swear they saw Elvis in the flesh long after he was said to be dead. Oddly enough, in the 80s, a singer named Jimmy Ellis started performing Elvis songs as well as random covers while wearing a mask. Ellis, who sounded eerily like the king, had limited success before being killed in a robbery in 1998. Of course, there is an entire economy built around Elvis impersonators. But what proof is there that Elvis did die? Well, where do I start? While 42 is much less than the average lifespan of your average American, Elvis was hardly your average American. But also, let's not forget that 42 is a whole 15 years older than 27, which is, for some reason, the age that a lot of rock stars have died. As much as he liked to remind everyone that he was really just a God-fearing, church-going country boy at heart, his medical records showed that even if that was the case, he was also suffering from diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, glaucoma, liver disease, and had an enlarged colon likely caused by his overuse of laxatives. He also had emphysema, though he never smoked. That we know of. Shirley Temple smoked, but no one knew it. His heart was supposedly twice the normal size. He regularly took drugs to get to sleep, drugs to wake up, and inevitably drugs to keep the side effects of other drugs under control. Elvis insisted, though, that he wasn't a drug addict, to use the parlance of his day, because addicts, he said, bought drugs on the street. He bought them in pharmacies from real pharmacists who were doing what pharmacists do, which is fill prescriptions made out by real doctors who ostensibly had good reason to sign their names to such instructions. According to a piece on PBS.org by Dr. Howard Markle, quote, his medicine chest was filled with amber-colored, white-topped vials of medications in doses no responsible doctor would have prescribed, end quote. The doctor in charge of writing Elvis's prescriptions was Dr. George Nicopolis, or the aforementioned Dr. Nick. He was found to have written 199 prescriptions for Elvis in the first 8 months of 1977. That amounted to 10,000 doses of uppers, downers, and narcotics, and the year was only 2/3 done. If you divide that 10,000 into days with no weekends off, he was taking 40 pills a day to function. I guess it's not always good to be the king. While Elvis's medical records aren't available to the general public, a small handful of experts have been given access, including Dr. Forrest Tennant, who acted as an expert witness when Dr. Nicopolis stood trial in 1981, accused of overprescribing medicine to Elvis, which led to his eventual and untimely death. He was acquitted of all 11 counts. In a 2013 paper about his findings, Tennant concluded that Elvis was in full-body deterioration, with every organ in some state of disarray or shutdown. He said that, to him at least, there was plenty of evidence that Elvis sustained a series of head injuries which set off an undiagnosed autoimmune inflammatory disorder that kept eating away the man's innards. This wasn't something Elvis or his doctors would have been able to identify at the time, but today we understand that all his chronic pain, his obesity, his irrationality, his constipation, and his heart issues could be explained by the autoimmune disease that the brain injuries had put into motion. Which is nothing but tragic, if true. Though I would also venture to guess that at least some of those symptoms were at least in part also due to the drug use itself. Irrationality, as we know, is a pretty common symptom of prolonged drug use. Indeed, I would argue, as an amateur, that the letter Elvis wrote to Nixon shows some evidence of paranoia that often comes with overindulgence in drugs. But, of course, the theory posited by Tennant came decades after Elvis's death and the medical examiner's official report done at the time of his death. When Dr. Jerry Francisco, Shelby County, Tennessee medical examiner, issued his report on August 16, 1977, hours before anyone had so much as cut into Elvis for autopsy purposes, he firmly maintained that Elvis had died of hypersensitive cardiovascular arrest associated with atherosclerotic heart disease. We who did not go to medical school like to call that a heart attack. To be fair, it was probably a safe assumption given the evidence, but one would hope official reports would be based on more than assumption. It was a tidy medical explanation for his death that did not acknowledge the amount and variety of drugs found in his system. But the doctors at Baptist Memorial, who performed the first post-mortem on Elvis, all agree that while his heart was not in good shape, it was years away from killing him. In a 2020 special years later, one of the 8 physicians present for the autopsy, Dr. Noel Florendo, MD, said that there was no morphological evidence of arrhythmia or heart attack. He added that at no time have any of the 8 agreed with the ME's findings. But also, 8 doctors? Who has 8 doctors at their autopsy? That would later be called a cover-up by those who are inclined toward conspiracy theories. In 1979, famous butthead Geraldo Rivera brought the cover-up to the world's attention in a 1-hour episode of ABC News' magazine program 2020. By then, most everyone knew that Elvis had, reports vary here, 8, 10, or 14 different drugs roaming around in his blood system at the time of his death, including significant quantities of codeine, morphine, quaaludes, Valium, phenobarbital, pentobarbital, and butobarbital, and a kind of synthetic heroin called Dilaudid. Still, those close to him insisted his death couldn't be an overdose because Elvis was an experienced drug user. He knew what and how much to take to get the results he wanted, or so they said. He also knew what he could mix successfully without making a lethal cocktail. I mean, I'd wager that most people who die from overdoses are relatively experienced drug users, but that's the thing about taking drugs. You build up a tolerance, and eventually you need more and more in order to achieve that desired result, and all it takes is one time of taking too much. Also, not for nothing, but most people agree he didn't die of an acute overdose the way we usually think of an overdose. He didn't take too much of a drug at one time. Most likely, he took too many drugs at the right dose over too long a period of time, and his body couldn't process it anymore. Even if he died of a heart attack from straining on the toilet, chances are both the condition of his heart and his constipation was the result of the drugs he'd been taking for years. As Dr. Markle wrote, quote, "Throw in the obesity Elvis suffered from near the end of his life, what appears to be type 2 diabetes, an enlarged heart, and a steady diet of unhealthy, fatty, and fried foods, along with his notorious prescription pill consumption, and you have the perfect prescription for disaster." End quote. Those close to Elvis reported he was allergic to codeine and would never, ever have ingested that drug. But again, sometimes those who are taking a lot of drugs might not be thinking tremendously clearly. Could it be that as a result of not being in the right state of mind and or because of his glaucoma, he picked up a pill bottle that wasn't prescribed to him? Could it be that someone else in his household, family, friends, staff, had a bottle of codeine and Elvis took some by mistake? In the 1990 book, The Death of Elvis, What Really Happened, authors Charles Thompson II and James Cole are certain that Elvis died after 10 times the normal therapeutic dose of codeine, something he was allergic to. Where they got this information, I don't know. But remember that midnight dental appointment? Maybe the dentist didn't know of Elvis's allergy? Now, mind you, a lot of what we know of Elvis's medical information was not taken from the official autopsy, which is the private property of the Presley family, and was never considered for public consumption because his death was determined to be natural and therefore not a criminal matter. So, a lot of the discussion around Elvis's death is speculation. The official death certificate won't see the light of day until 2027, when Tennessee law finally dictates that it can be released, 50 years after the king's death. I'll do a follow-up episode then. Some question the ME report, and not just because they think heart attack is code for drug overdose, but because it wasn't signed until October 1977, 2 months after the death occurred. Which is admittedly odd. But was it sinister? Indicative of shenanigans? What do I know? Maybe the ME was busy. Most of the rest of the pathologists in the pantheon of star pathologists, then and now, disagree with the Shelby County ME. They all say, given the records they've seen as produced in various trials, records created by the leading bioscientific labs in the country at the time, that Elvis died of polypharmacy, a prolonged overdose of drugs, most of which had the express function of suppressing the central nervous system, slowing down breathing, slowing the heart, and dulling the brain to the point that it forgets to tell the lungs and the heart to keep up the good work. There's another thing about the ME's report that bolsters a lot of the he didn't die talk. Some believers have suggested that the whole thing was written in Elvis's handwriting, which has been checked on and off for years, and agreement on that is elusive. This is just, come on. Why on earth, if they were trying to pull off one of the greatest hoaxes of all time, would they make such a stupid mistake? There were plenty of other people who could have written the report if they were trying to write a fake report. Also, on the ME report, which he may or may not have penned himself, Elvis is listed as weighing 170 pounds. Maybe the handwritten item was a mistake? In August 1977, he weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 260 pounds, give or take. Those who believe he lives among us say that maybe his dead stand-in weighed 170 pounds, and that all that evidence of drugs were indeed what did in the man who gave his life, so Elvis could escape unscathed. In fact, some believe that the Switch Guy hoax was so successful that the whole Michael Jackson-Lisa Marie Presley marriage was just an exercise so that Jackson could learn how Elvis did it, and thus pull off the same vanishing act. Okay. Back to the matter at hand. So what if I'm just a Debbie Downer and Elvis really did go into hiding because he was close to taking down the mafia as part of an elaborate FBI sting headed up by one of the most famous people who ever lived? The first posthumous Elvis sighting was on the day after he was said to have died. It was reported that a man named John Burroughs had been seen in the Memphis airport boarding a plane alone bound for Buenos Aires. Trouble with that one was that there were no flights at the time that went to Buenos Aires out of that airport, and when checked, no airline booked a passenger by that name going anywhere. Not to mention, why would he have flown commercial when he owned a private jet? Also, John Burroughs was the name Elvis used when he wanted to check into a hotel unnoticed. It was the name he gave Nixon if the president had wanted to contact him while he was staying in a hotel in Washington, D.C. Hardly that much of a secret identity to adopt posthumously. But wait, you gotta go further back, to say 1970, a time when Elvis the Pelvis had spent 15 years shaking up popular music, a whole generation of parents, their children, and the acceptability of overt sexuality on the silver screen. He'd gained a lot of weight, wearing those white bejeweled jumpsuits and handing out sweaty scarves to the swooners at his concerts. He knew he wasn't 18 anymore. He wasn't in shape. He didn't know how he could maintain that lifestyle for the rest of his life. He'd already been suckered out of a lot of his money by his manager, Colonel Parker. His beloved mother was dead, and many of the people in his inner circle were paid to be there. They even ran around procuring him drugs from 24-hour pharmacies in the middle of the night at his beck and call, as was done the night before he died. Where today someone in his position might be able to check themselves into a very exclusive rehab and come out a changed person, that really wasn't considered a good PR move in the 70s, so maybe he needed to dip out permanently in order to get clean and live a healthier life. So it has gone. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The lost, omitted, or ignored autopsy and pathology reports, official and unofficial, simply muddied the already dense waters surrounding his death. Anyone could posit a theory, posit a response, posit a rebuttal, posit another theory. And we are left with what, exactly? Suicide? Not likely. Accidental death? Sure. Drug overdose? Of course. Natural causes? Not a chance. Heart disease? Not in the picture. Exploded arteries due to constant constipation? Understandable, if embarrassing. Maybe he just wanted to sleep. Same, friend. Still, it's a puzzle. Elvis has had an amazing afterlife. The number of records he sold is reported to be in excess of 1 billion. The number of tchotchkes sold with his likeness on them is likely 10 times that. The whole Elvis impersonator industry is alive and still well all over the world, including at one of my favorite Thai restaurants in Los Angeles. Elvis will always be a unique phenomenon, which I guess means he is alive. And for those who believe it is literally so, who am I to say you're wrong? Next time on Strange and Unexplained. On September 8th, 1900, the people of Galveston, Texas were met with a hurricane they should have seen coming. The arrogance and hubris of one man may have gotten thousands of innocent people killed, and may explain why so many of them still hang around in death. Strange and Unexplained is a production of Three Goose Entertainment with help from Grab Bag Collab. This episode was written by me and Amy Wilson, who also did the research. Editing help from Amber Hunt, and sound engineering and mixing by Henry Lavoie. If you have an idea for an episode, head to our website, strangeandunexplainedpod.com, and fill out the contact form. I will write back. For more amazing content, join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab. Join me on Instagram at SNUpod, Daisy Egan, and Grabbag Collab, or head to the Facebook page to join in the conversation. If you like the show, please visit a sponsor with our unique code, give us a quick review and 5 stars, subscribe and download, and tell a friend. If you don't like the show, the name of the podcast is Bill O'Reilly's No Spin News and Analysis. Also, I know a lot of you really like these tags, but I'm genuinely running out of extremist right-wing podcasts to troll. Feel free to send suggestions. Stay strange.